economic union. Michael was educated at Harvard, Trinity College Dublin, and the LSE. He co-founded ZYEN in 1994 and created the Global Financial Centres Index. He's an emeritus professor and trustee at Gresham College. His book, The Price of Fish, A New Approach to Wicked Economics and Better Decisions, won the 2012 Independent Publishers Book Awards Finance, Investment and Economics Gold Prize. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Michael Minnelli.
Well, thank you. That's extraordinarily kind. I'm delighted to be here today. It's with some trepidation, I hasten to add, when you come up on stage after somebody who does 927 speeches a year, you realize you're very unlikely to shine. But I'll do my best to set the scene this morning. When Herbie and I were chatting about this conference many months ago, I think we made two important changes. The first is you'll notice the lovely orange logo that Herbie's done, which suits the church here, the famous Dutch church. The second thing was that we'd originally thought this might be a conference about where insurance exchanges should meet capital markets exchanges. But on the morning of the 24th, we realized that nobody would have much interest in that on the 24th of June, and we decided we'd change the conference to something about Brexit. But we also realized that by the time the conference was held, people would be bored to tears with Brexit. And so we thought we would look really at what might the new shape of Europe be. And we thought about this theme, towards a new Hanseatic League. Now, some of the things that are quite interesting about the Hanseatic League will come out in my talk in a moment. But I think it's also important just to look at where we are today. We're here in the Dutch Church, which was founded in the early 1500s as part of the Reformation movement. A very peculiar and interesting relationship with Henry VIII and later his son. And this church is quite a venerable and old one, and it sits on the site of Augustinian Prior, the Augustinian Friary, after which the area is named, Austin Friars. And you'll see around here some very, very, very venerable city institutions. Just up the road is the Carpenters, one of the older livery companies. One of the wealthiest livery companies, Drapers, is just behind the church here. In fact, for those of you of an historical bent, this is the site of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. This is Thomas Cromwell occupied what is currently Drapers Hall today. And as you walk around here, you'll see that vehicles are restricted in their access and their tonnage to about 1.5 tons. The reason for that is if you have a heavier vehicle, it will go crashing down into the cellars, which extend some 60 to 70 feet down and are actually Thomas Cromwell's original wine cellars. So it's a very interesting area. And I think it shows the importance of trade to the City of London, as Sir Michael was saying. This has been a trading entrepot, really, since the 16th century, when it moved from being largely a commodities exporting country to being a country based much more around trade. Now, trade is an important thing. As we look around the global centers around the world, what makes them function is trade. They grow. There's no need for finance in many ways when you're just doing some sort of agricultural commodity or extraction industry. What drives financial services is trade itself. So what I'd like to do is challenge you today to consider what is the future trading landscape of Europe going to look like over the next, say, 500 years. And to do that, we're going to look back 500 years as well. Now, the global trading landscape that we see today is one that I think is intrinsically based around digital. And digital has changed from sort of old maps of the one on the previous slide to a world where we're looking at something like over 100 centers would claim to be financial centers globally. And there'll be some centers that will be represented here today that aren't actually on our slide at all. But we track about 100 of these centers. Why is that fun or interesting? Well, it's interesting because financial centers give a huge amount of vibrancy to the places where they're located. You get a lot of economic advantages in terms of information. Being part of this network allows you to gain from global trade, even if you're not actually producing. And I think from a policymaker's perspective, it's one of the very interesting areas where you can make or break an entire sector based on policy decisions alone. As Sir Michael pointed out, business-friendly is arguably, the first starting point to building a financial center. They can also come crashing down. The history of London is not one of seamless rise. It's had several periods of punctuation, most recently after the war. Yes, there were the Eurobond markets, but FX didn't really take off until exchange controls were removed in October '79. So the modern city that we're all proud of here is actually a relatively recent invention in terms of scale. And this little picture over here on the right will just give you, it's from the 1375 Catalan Atlas, their world map, their Mappa Mundi. And it shows a king, the richest king in the world in 1375. Widely reputed. Any guesses? Timbuktu. And today, Mali is just a desert wasteland, you know, where the sands and the tumbleweeds effectively kind of blow through the city. So you can make and break a financial center, you know, very, very easily. We'll have an entire session on that this afternoon. But the theme today is also about the Hansa. Well, I was desperate to try and find a Trump or a Clinton slide, but I had to get the slides in before the election the other day. So I was unable to, but I thought I'd go back to Bush, you know, read my lips, trade, you know, that's what it's all about. The Hanseatic League was founded roughly 1159 in Lubeck, and it died out roughly about 1669. We'll see that in a minute. But broadly speaking, for 400 years, it dominated Northern Europe. The trade routes really began out of Lubeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, and we're privileged today to have Professor Hans-Jörg Schmidt-Trenz here from Hamburg, who knows far more about that area than I do. And branching out from those Freistaats, or the Hanseatic Free States, it is argued by many scholars, or some scholars at least, that it contained up to about 70 cities. The cities were broadly Germanic, in fact, Blattdeutsch as opposed to just Germanic in total, but there were foreign cities involved in it. And the Hanseatic League, during this period, although it had a tremendous amount of trade influence, is in many ways probably more important in the modern era for the myths that it left us. And that mythical influence is extremely strong. If you've ever traveled across northern Germany, you will find Hansa everything. We've got signs proclaiming the free and Hanseatic states of Hamburg or Lübeck. We have books like Derek Meister's books surrounding Lübeck in the early days. We have things like Hansa Sail. We have a Hansa Museum in Lübeck. There's a tremendous amount of things that celebrate the Hanseatic League. People are extremely proud of it. My favorite is probably there on the top, Hansaplast. So you can actually have Hansa plasters when you get a wound. You know, you're able to heal yourself with the Hansa. Actually, it had a far more important role, though, in shaping our views of commerce. Intriguingly, Adam Smith in 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, refers to the Hanseatic League. Now, what's he referring to? I mean, I just told you that the League effectively had its last meeting in 1669. He's writing over 100 years later. He didn't have Wikipedia. His library facilities up in Edinburgh would have been okay, but nothing brilliant. What did he think of the Hansa? Well, he was going on this myth of strong, independent states trading freely with each other without central control, which of course is the theme of The Wealth of Nations in many ways, the individual parts being greater when they're assembled. Another area often unremarked is that the Hanseatic League features very strongly in the Federalist Papers. For those of you who are not up on your American history, having had a go at a poor sort of Articles of Confederation, the Americans in 1789 came up with a new constitution. But this constitution had to be sold to the people. And so three writers, John Adams, Andrew Hamilton, and John Jay, wrote a series of argumentative papers under pseudonyms where they would argue the pros and cons of various bits of the Constitution as it was assembled. And one of the most important bits was how would these states trade with each other? And they referred copiously in the Federalist Papers to this Hanseatic League and why it was such a good thing and why it was so important. And again, they, like Adam Smith, didn't have the wealth of modern research. So they were going on the myth. The myth was very, very important to people. Well, what was the reality? Well, as I said earlier, possibly up to about 70 cities were involved in the Hanseatic League. And something most Londoners don't know is that the Hanseatic League extended what were called contours or warehouses, effectively outposts that they had. And these outposts were all across England: Boston, King's Lynn, Hull, Norwich, Yarmouth, Ipswich. These all had contours. And here in London, we had our own contour. In fact, etymologists believe that the very word sterling for our pound comes from the Bristol contour, and they were referring to the solidity of the money that the Easterlings had, the Easterlings being the Hanseatic League. So you can see this intense association here. Within London itself, we have great Hanseatic inspirations. The top right here, there's a plaque to what is called the Stahlhof. The Stahlhof, or steel yard, was an area exclusively reserved for these German merchants. It occupies the site of Cannon Street, and during that period it was restricted access for English people. They were unable to enter this area freely. So think about it. Here in the center of London, we had a free trade zone for 500 years that locals were not allowed to go into. Hans Holbein actually came over to London to paint because he could freely go into this area. And finally, just to kind of round out the history, when Cannon Street was being constructed in 1853, the land was bought from the three cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, who still owned it in 1853. But it's not all rosy or romantic. There are quite a few cautionary lessons one can learn from the Hanse. This is a picture of a museum that I sailed into off Simbister in the Shetland Isles. I sailed into this boring little village, not expecting to find a full-blown Hanseatic museum. Such are the wonders of the EU, who had funded it. Anyway, there I am in this little museum, finding out all sorts of things, but also the oppression that was there. The Shetlands produced about 10% of salted fish across Europe, and the Hanseatic merchants had grabbed that and created a monopoly. There were several uprisings in the Shetland Islands where the German merchants were killed, revolution, if you will. And then finally, when they managed to break free in the late 1600s, they then had the joys of the Act of Union of 1707, which meant that, again, the English took over their fisheries and created another monopoly. So what do we learn in terms of things, in terms of cautions? Well, I think the biggest thing was, there's many arguments about why the Hanseatic League didn't persist, but I think one of them is it didn't make a lot of friends. It had a very, very monopolistic approach to life, and if it could establish a monopoly, it would use it and oppress it. So it wasn't quite the paragon of free trade that we like to think. And of course, this then coincides with the rise of the nation state, and that tension between the nation state and its various constituent parts, be they regions or states or Länder or cities or city-states, is always going to be a tough one. So what kind of lessons can we learn? Well, I think the first thing is you really can't be an international business center without international people. You need to have a free flow of people and trade, and the Hanse was famous for the flows of people and really establishing the rights to travel and the rights to trade and fighting for them when it could. It wasn't a pure situation, but the idea was to open up those trade corridors. The second thing was it celebrated its internationalism, its cosmopolitan nature. These were very sophisticated people. They loved art. They were patrons of many things. And the last thing is that their reputations grew, and they built on their reputations. There's no particular reason to go to a square or a yard in Hamburg over a square or yard somewhere in Göttingen, but if you knew that you could find more trade, that made it more attractive. So what does that mean perhaps for London? Well, this is, I think, the point of our discussion today. What would London be as a Brexit financial center? I think there's some essentials that we still haven't solved. What is the status of EU nationals? We're still very confused about what passporting or access rights mean for various financial services firms. And something I like to bring up repeatedly is that the general data protection requirements of the EU will need to be met if we're going to trade. So we can have passporting and we can have visas, but if we can't operate on data in this digital economy, we're not going to get very far. But is there perhaps a new London of the radical center? Can we in fact rethink anti-money laundering, KYC, ultimate beneficial ownership? And we'll have a session later today with Kamala Buchholz on some of that. But how can we be open to business? The second thing is, placing business. We've tended, I think, to be talking about keeping all the business here in London. And I've seen some very interesting things. Beppe Pazzulli will be up here talking about the bridge between London and Milan. Trade is not a one-way street. It is not to one's advantage. The whole notion of trade is paradoxical. It has to be to mutual advantage, or it won't happen. And then I think the final thing is, how safe are we for business? I think in this world, the one thing that does seem to be the case, whether it's Brexit or the recent American elections, but it is pretty clear that the electorate has a state of fear. And this state of fear is one that has to be recognized and dealt with. So what might a new league look like? Well, I always argue that the opposite of danger is taking risks. If you don't take any risks, you will be in danger. And I think as we look at the things that we could do here in London or in Europe, perhaps we ought to be thinking about a new league. Maybe we need to get past some of the sclerosis of the nation states. Think about things like direct city visas. Could we have financial services passports so that if I'm able to do business in Milan, I can equally do it in Madrid or Dublin or Hamburg? It's as simple as that. I've basically got a passport for my AML KYC. Could we look at reciprocal arrangements in that area? Could we look at reciprocal or umbrella regulatory arrangements? Why is it always a national regulator? Perhaps in the new world where Britain needs to bridge with the EU, we ought to be reaching out to the Dutch or to the Swiss or to the Irish and say, well, if you recognize us, we'll recognize you. I think these are all ideas worth tossing around, because the one thing that I think Brexit and the recent US election shows is the current world order will change, possibly needs to change. And if it is going to change, well, I think it's far better we discuss what might change and toss some ideas around. So whenever I give a lot of these talks, I save all of my strategic slides, my statistical slides, but people always ask me, what's the one true strategy for success in being a financial center, being an exchange? And it's really quite simple. If you had to have a single mantra as you walk around, Sir Michael was quite right to enumerate many characteristics, and our survey enumerates some 105 characteristics in the same groups that he did, business environment, infrastructure, etc. That's a lot to keep in your head. And the one thing I've always said is, if you treat all comers fairly, you will have a successful financial center. And that reminds me of, I guess, two things I might like to close on while my panelists get ready to come up. I think the first is that one of my favorite phrases is a talk which I guess Trump might give, who knows, but it was actually the 1803 inaugural speech of Thomas Jefferson as he became president. And in that speech, he said that the most important thing, as far as he was concerned, for America as it was trying to grow was commerce and honest friendship with all. So, very much emphasizing this point about treating all comers fairly. And the second thing that is possibly one of my favorite phrases, if you were my children, you'd be groaning by now, and that's that when you face situations like this, where there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and perhaps even a little spot of fear here or there, I always say, let's be optimistic. Pessimism is for better times. So with that, could I